The cylinder alone weighs more than 2 loaded Glock 17s, not the revolver. The cylinder, 2 kilograms of steel, bored with chambers deep enough to swallow a rifle cartridge whole. Set it down on a workbench and it doesn't clatter. It thuds. The complete gun weighs 6 kilograms, 13¼ pounds, and measures 55 centimeters from hammer spur to muzzle. Hold it out at arm's length, and your shoulder starts negotiating with you within about 10 seconds. Here is the part that shouldn't work. This thing barely kicks. Not brutal, but survivable. Not manageable for what it is. The man who commissioned it fired the first version standing, one-handed, no rest, no brace, and let people photograph him doing it. A revolver built around a cartridge designed to stop a charging bull elephant, fired like a colt at a county fair. That is not a fluke, and it is not a trick. It is an exchange, a very expensive one. And by the end of this, you will know exactly what got traded away to buy it. But the problem being solved here is a century older than the gun, and the men who created it never solved it at all. In January 1899, the London gun-making firm of W.J. Jeffrey began drafting something deliberately excessive. Black powder express rifles in 4-bore and 8-bore had ruled the elephant fields for decades, and they were miserable objects, enormous, slow, and wrapped in smoke that hung in the air and announced to every animal within half a mile exactly where you were standing. Cordite changed the arithmetic. Smokeless powder meant more velocity from less bulk, and the London trade spent the 1890s systematically reloading every old black powder case with the new propellant. Jeffrey decided to end the argument. Their first rifle for the new cartridge sold on the 30th of April 1900 for 30 pounds. The first known double rifle followed the next February for 35. By 1902, the round was standardized, and the specification reads less like a cartridge than like a demolition charge. A 3-inch rimmed case, 100 grains of cordite, a bullet weighing 900 grains. 900 grains is 58 grams. A lead projectile with roughly the mass of a chicken egg, 0.6 of an inch across, leaving the muzzle somewhere between 1,800 and 2,000 feet per second, depending on the load. They called it the .600 Nitro Express. Now, an important distinction, because almost everybody gets this wrong. The .600 was not built to kill elephants. Smaller rifles killed elephants perfectly well and did it every day. The .600 was built to stop one. Those are different engineering problems. Killing is a question of penetration and placement over time. Stopping is a question of putting enough energy into bone and brain right now. While 4 tons of animal closes the distance, and you have somewhere between 2 and 3 seconds left to work with. Major Percy Powell Cotton, who carried a Jeffrey .600 in equatorial Africa, described the result in a letter the company was very happy to print. A frontal shot at an elephant, 40 yards. The bullet drove 27 inches, through skin, bone, flesh, bone, brain, and bone again. The animal dropped where it stood. That was the promise. The bill came attached. To keep recoil inside human tolerance, rifles chambered. For the .600 had to weigh up to 16 pounds. 15 was typical. A double rifle that heavy is not something you carry through thorn scrub for 9 hours, so the professionals didn't. They handed it to a gun bearer who walked behind them all day and took it back only when the situation had already gone wrong. That was the doctrine, and it tells you everything about the cartridge. The .600 lived in another man's hands until the moment it was needed, because a hunter who had carried 15 pounds since dawn would be too spent to use it when it mattered. One professional called his an insurance policy, not a working tool, a last resort. Insurance policies age badly. The 600 Nitro Express held the title of most powerful commercially available sporting cartridge on Earth for more than half a century, until Holland & Holland went one size larger and took it away. Across the entire life of the design, Jeffrey built somewhere around 70 rifles for it. 70. 4 different actions spread over decades. By the 1990s, the round was a curiosity. Ammunition was scarce and expensive. The rifles were auction pieces. The empire the cartridge had been built to serve no longer existed, and neither did the profession that had needed it, which is precisely when a man in Feldkirch, Austria, decided to build something new around it. His name was Pfeifer-Zeliska. Born in 1938, and this matters, he was not a hunter and not a gunmaker. He was an inventor and a competitive sports shooter, and in 1995, he walked into a small Austrian gunsmith shop with a request that should have ended the conversation on the spot. He didn't want a rifle. He wanted a revolver, and he had no intention of pointing it at anything with a heartbeat. The hard part was never the pressure. That is what people assume, that a cartridge this size is a containment problem, an explosion looking for somewhere to escape. It isn't. Steel is very good at holding pressure. Gunmakers settled that argument in the 19th century and have been refining the answer ever since. The hard part is geometry, and after geometry, physics. Start with the cartridge sitting on the bench. 3 inches of case, 3 7/10 inches loaded, 94 millimeters. You could stand 3 9mm rounds on top of one another and still come up short. Whatever cylinder you build has to be longer than that. So before you have drawn a single other part, you have already committed to a cylinder the size of a small pistol. Now look at the base of the cartridge. The rim measures 0.8 of an inch across, 20 millimeters. Arrange those in a circle. Leave enough steel between each chamber to survive being fired next to a detonating neighbor, and the diameter runs away from you fast. This is where the first real decision gets made, and it is pure arithmetic. 6 chambers, and the webs of metal between them thin out to something you would not want to stand behind. 5 chambers, and every one of those walls gets meaningfully thicker for free. 5 it is. Not tradition, not style, just the number the geometry permits. And because those walls still have to hold at that diameter, the cylinder is machined from a tungsten-steel alloy, denser and harder than ordinary gun steel, and considerably less pleasant to cut. What comes off the machine is 4.5 pounds of rotating mass that the shooter's thumb has to index, one click at a time, against its own inertia. Which brings up the second decision, and the one that looks most like a mistake. The Pfeifer-Zeliska is a single-action revolver. Cock the hammer by hand, fire, cock it again. It loads through a small gate on the right side of the frame, one cartridge at a time, exactly the way a Colt single-action army loaded in 1873. In an age of swing-out cylinders and double-action triggers, the most extreme handgun anyone had built in a century was structurally a scaled-up peacemaker. There is nothing nostalgic about that. A swing-out cylinder needs a crane, an arm that carries the cylinder out to the side and brings it back into alignment. That crane is the single most abused component in any modern Magnum revolver. It is a hinge asked to hold 2 kilograms of steel in perfect register against forces measured in tons. So delete it. Keep the frame solid and unbroken, one continuous loop of metal around the cylinder, and cut a door in the side to load through. The frame stops being an assembly and becomes a ring. The action goes the same way. A double action trigger drags the cylinder around, cocks the hammer and releases it, all through one linkage, and every part in that linkage is a part that can fail under load. Single action deletes most of them. On a gun this heavy, the trigger pull barely matters anyway. Nobody is shooting 6 kilograms in a hurry. Then the barrel. 13 inches, ported near the muzzle. 13 is a compromise between two masters, long enough to make some use of the powder charge, short enough that the object remains technically a handgun. But there is a third function, and it is the one that matters here. A 13-inch barrel is a long steel lever hanging out ahead of the shooter's hands, and mass that far forward fights muzzle rise before the muzzle has finished rising. The ports finish the job. Openings cut near the muzzle vent, escaping gas upward, pushing the barrel down while the bullet is still on its way out. You pay for that in noise and side blast, and the bill goes straight to the person holding it. Now assemble all of it, and you arrive at the idea underneath this gun. 6 kilograms is not an accident. It is not the price of strength. It is the mechanism. The physics is uncomfortably simple. When the round fires, the bullet and the gas go one way carrying a certain amount of momentum, and the gun goes the other way carrying exactly the same amount. That total is fixed by the cartridge, and no design on earth reduces it. But the energy that momentum turns into, the shove that arrives in your hands, depends on how much mass it has to move. Put the same momentum into a heavier gun, and the gun comes back at you slower. Slower matters far more than people expect, because recoil energy rises with the square of that speed. So the design is not heavy in spite of the recoil. It is heavy as the answer to it. The weight is the brake, and every other choice, the dense alloy, the oversized cylinder, the long barrel, is a way of buying more of it without the thing turning into an obvious lump of ballast. That single idea is why this series exists. If it's the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing is what keeps this channel pointed at objects like this one instead of at whatever is trending this week. It makes a real difference. Back to the workshop, because the workshop is where the theory stops. The gun was built in Feldkirch, Austria, by a small firm called Pfeifer-Waffen. Not stamped, not tooled for volume. Every part made by hand and fitted individually to its own specific revolver. Two Zeliskas are not interchangeable. They are siblings, not copies, and the first one, finished in 1995, was not chambered in .600 Nitro Express at all. It was a .458 Winchester Magnum, 5.2 kilograms unloaded, 5,797 joules at the muzzle, a rifle cartridge in a revolver on paper. Paper is where projects like this usually stop. A specification, a display case, a photograph in a magazine. Zeliska had no interest in that. He built it to be fired repeatedly in public by himself, which left exactly one question that no calculation on the bench could answer. The hammer falls and the gun does not snap. That is the first thing people get wrong when they picture it. They imagine a slap, the sharp wrist-punishing crack of a Magnum revolver, scaled up until something gives. What actually happens is slower and much stranger. The whole mass shifts. The muzzle climbs, but it climbs like a drawbridge, deliberately, and by the time it is finished moving, your hands have already taken most of it. The sound is enormous. The motion is not. Put numbers on it, and the effect stops being mysterious. Take the first gun, the .458 Winchester Magnum, a 300-grain bullet leaving at 772 meters per second out of 5.2 kilograms of steel. Work the momentum through and the free recoil lands somewhere near 40 joules. Call it 30 foot-pounds. A Smith & Wesson .500 Magnum, the gun most shooters treat as the outer edge of handgun punishment, weighs about 2 kilograms and comes in near 65 joules. So the largest revolver in the world kicked less than the Big Smith, not marginally, by something like a third. That is why the photograph exists. Zeliska standing, one hand, no brace, not straining. A man operating equipment he built and understood. But the .600 version, when it finally came, was not going to be quite so polite, and it is worth being precise about why. Fire the big cartridge out of 6 kilograms and the free recoil roughly doubles, somewhere past 80 joules, which is more than the Smith, not less. The difference is speed. The heavier gun comes back at the shooter at around 5 meters per second, where the Smith is closer to 8. Similar energy, delivered over a longer push, spread across 3 times the mass. Your hands do not register joules. They register how fast something arrives. So the honest version of the claim is this. The Zeliska does not kick softly. It kicks slowly. And slowly is survivable in a way that fast is not. The real punishment is somewhere else entirely, and it is exactly the bill the ported barrel promised. Those vents dump high-pressure gas upward and sideways, a few inches from the shooter's face, out of a case holding a rifle-sized powder charge. What arrives is less recoil than concussion, a pressure wave through the sinuses and the chest. Shooters flinch from the blast long before their wrists have anything to complain about, which raises the obvious question. Does it actually do anything? A plate of structural steel, 12 millimeters thick, hung free so it could swing. Nothing behind it. Nothing bracing it. 15 meters. The point, 4.58. Zeliska went through it. With a specially prepared hand load, the same 300-grain bullet reached 792 meters per second and cleared 6,000 joules at the muzzle. The freely suspended plate is the harder test, incidentally. A fixed target has to resist. A hanging one can swing away and shed the impact, unless the bullet arrives faster than the plate can move, and the gun did not stay in the demonstration business. In 2008, at the FAA shoot in Philipsburg, the Swiss shooter Peter Geismann won the Flying Pigs competition with a record distance, using a .458 Zeliska. The event is exactly as strange as it sounds. A steel silhouette pig, 110 by 200 millimeters, 2 kilograms of 10 millimeter armor plate, set in a wooden rail at chest height 10 meters out. You do not shoot holes in it. You knock it off the rail and measure how far it flies. 13 years after the first one was built, the Zeliska was still winning, not on a hunt. In a sport almost nobody outside a small European circle has ever heard of. That tells you what the gun had quietly become. Not a stopping weapon. A machine for moving steel. Now the other column. The short barrel costs more than people realize. The 600 cartridge was regulated in rifles with 28-inch barrels, and it needs that length to burn what is packed into the case. Give it 13 inches instead and roughly a quarter of the muzzle velocity simply never happens. Which, because energy climbs with the square of speed, means close to half the cartridge's potential gets left behind as muzzle flash. You are firing an elephant round at nowhere near elephant round performance. The format wastes it. Then the practicalities. 5 shots, and no quick way to replace them. Ammunition no factory produces in volume, at a price that turns a range session into a decision rather than a habit. And the thing nobody thinks about until they try it. Aiming. 6 kilograms is fine for the 2 seconds a shot takes. It is not fine for the 30 seconds of holding steady beforehand. The arms shake, the front sight wanders in slow circles, and getting the gun pointed anywhere useful becomes a small athletic event of its own. So by 1996, Zeliska had a revolver that fired a rifle cartridge from a handheld frame, defeated structural steel, and did it without injuring the shooter, and that had no practical job anywhere on Earth. What he had instead was numbers. And numbers are the language of records. So he wrote to Guinness. The reply came back in 1996, and it had nothing to do with the revolver. Guinness declined the application for strongest revolver in the world on the grounds that they had, some years earlier, removed everything in the category of wars and crimes from the book. Read that again, because the logic is worth unpacking. The gun was not measured. It was not compared against a rival, not found wanting, not disqualified on a technicality of testing. The entire category had been deleted before Zeliska ever wrote in. A sporting instrument that had never been pointed at anything but steel plate got filed under war and crime and swept out with everything else. For the shooting community, the decision was incomprehensible. Their argument was simple. This is a sport gun, not an instrument of either. So the record didn't exist. And it turned out that not having it mattered less than nothing, because 5 years later, Zeliska built the version that actually made him famous. And this time, he didn't need an adjudicator. The .600 Nitro Express revolver drew media attention in early 2001, presented as one of the most powerful revolvers in the world. 6,230 joules of muzzle energy, 6.5 kilograms on the scale. Martin Schober wrote it up in the Swiss firearms magazine SWM, issue 4, 2001. 2 pages. 2 pages in a Swiss trade magazine. That was the entire launch. What happened next was not planned by anybody and could not have been. The Zeliska arrived just as video was becoming the internet's native language, and it turned out to be almost perfectly built for that medium, not as a weapon, but as a shot. It is visually absurd. It is instantly legible. You do not need to know anything about firearms to understand a revolver the size of a forearm. Videos of Zeliska's guns went on to be watched millions of times, while the revolvers themselves were only ever produced in tiny numbers. A handful of objects exist. Millions of people have seen them fired, and it never crossed into the mainstream the way you would expect. On the Internet Movie Firearms database, an editor once questioned why the Zeliska had a page at all, on the grounds that the odds of it ever appearing in a film were minuscule. He was right. This gun's fame is native to the Internet. It skipped cinema completely and went straight from a Swiss magazine to the algorithm. But fame without a governing body is fame without a correction mechanism. And somewhere in that decade of copying and recopying, the numbers came loose. Look up the Zeliska's muzzle energy today, and you will find 2 answers. One set of sources says 7,591 foot-pounds, with the 900-grain bullet leaving at 1,950 feet per second. Another says 4,592 foot-pounds at 1,516 feet per second. Both cannot be true. And you don't need a chronograph to settle it. You need a calculator. Take the figures the manufacturer publishes. A 58.32-gram bullet at 462 meters per second. Half the mass times the velocity squared gives you about 6,200 joules, which converts to roughly 4,600 foot-pounds. The lower number. Almost exactly. So where did 1,950 feet per second come from? It is one of the 3 standard factory loadings for the .600 Nitro Express. The middle one, measured from a rifle. Somebody at some point took the cartridge's rifle velocity and attached it to the revolver. The error propagated, got quoted again, and now lives permanently in half the reference material on the internet. That is an inflation of about 65%. And it was never necessary, because the real number is already extraordinary. The same rot got into the origin story. You will find it stated in otherwise respectable places that the .600 Nitro Express was designed in 1903 by Holland & Holland. It wasn't. The cartridge came from W.J. Jeffrey and Company. Holland & Holland's contribution arrived much later, and it was the thing that dethroned it, the .700 Nitro Express, in 1988. Which brings us to the title itself and whether the Zeliska ever really held it. On size, it has never been unchallenged. There is the giant 1859 Remington, a 28mm revolver 4 feet 1 inch long. There is the Thompson Contender chambered in .600 Nitro Magnum. The usual formulation in the reference works is not the largest handgun in the world. It is the largest, except for these. On power, the claim is weaker still. A 14-inch revolver chambered in Zito 500 Bushwhacker produces roughly 10% more muzzle energy. Figures around 5,100 foot-pounds, against the Zeliska's 4,592. So, no Guinness record. Not definitively the largest. Not the most powerful. By every measurable standard, the Zeliska is a runner-up. And it is still, 25 years on, the first gun almost anybody names. Which means whatever people are actually buying when they buy one has very little to do with the numbers. Something else is changing hands. And the price tag tells you exactly what. Load all 5 chambers and you are holding $200 in your hand. Each .600 Nitro Express round runs around $40, which makes the gun very expensive to fire, and that figure is years old. The cartridge has not become more common since. Nobody mass produces it. There is no economy of scale because there is no scale. A few specialist makers loading small batches for a market of a few dozen people worldwide. The revolver itself sits at about $17,300, though other listings put it nearer 14,000 euros. The spread is normal for an object that gets quoted rather than priced. Now do the arithmetic, the owners do. A full cylinder costs about 1% of the gun, and it is gone in 5 trigger pulls. Empty it once a month, and you are paying a subscription fee for the privilege of hearing it. So most owners don't. The Zeliska has a strangely low round count for a gun that famously works. Many of them have fired fewer shots in 20 years than a service pistol fires in a morning. That is the first clue about what this object actually is. The second clue is in the metalwork. The hammer, the trigger, the pins, and several other parts are gold-plated for corrosion resistance, and frankly, for looks. The caliber and the maker's details are engraved and inlaid with gold as well. Gold on the hammer of a hunting revolver is a strange decision. Gold inlay spelling out a company address in Feldkirch is a stranger one. You do not sign a tool that way. You sign something that is going to be looked at, and the maker seems to have known fairly early which of the two he was building. The third clue is the caliber list. The Zeliska takes 5 rounds of either 600 Nitro Express or .458 Winchester Magnum. Those are not 2 versions of one idea. They are 2 different products. The .458 is the working gun. It came first in 1995. It is a kilogram lighter, and its ammunition is an ordinary rifle cartridge you can buy over a counter. It is the one that earned the reputation on steel plate and in competition. If you wanted to own a Zeliska and use it, this was always the answer. The .600 is the statement. It exists to be the largest number on the page, and the market chose the statement. Pfeifer built Zeliska one gun, then kept producing them to order, and made them in other calibers too, since not everyone wants to shoot .600 Nitro Express. A one-off commission turned into a standing product line, sustained by demand for a thing whose primary function is to be remarkable. Every single part is still made by hand and matched individually to its own revolver. It ships in a fitted case. Adolf Zeliska died on the 28th of January 2016 in Feldkirch, the town where he was born in 1938. He was 77. The revolver outlived him and is still built the same way, one at a time, on request. So what did he actually prove? Not that a handgun could be powerful. Plenty of people were chasing that, and a .500 Bushwhacker beat him on paper anyway. He proved something more useful and much less flattering. He found the exchange rate. The Zeliska is a measurement of what it costs to hold an elephant cartridge in your hand, and the price is itemized on the gun itself. 6 kilograms of mass. A 2-kilogram cylinder. 13 inches of ported barrel. 5 rounds instead of 6. a loading gate from 1873, and a quarter of the cartridge's velocity surrendered to a barrel too short to burn its own powder. Pay every line of that, and the reward is a revolver that barely kicks. That is the answer to the question this series opened with, and it is not a clever piece of engineering. It is a purchase. The recoil never went anywhere. It was bought off with weight, and almost everything that makes a handgun got spent at the till. It also explains why nobody has meaningfully beaten it in 25 years. There is no breakthrough waiting to be found. To go significantly further, you would have to add more mass, and past 6 kilograms, you are no longer building a handgun. You are building a very short rifle with a terrible grip. The Zeliska did not run into a materials limit or a manufacturing limit. It ran into the edge of the category. If you want more objects taken apart like this, the engineering underneath the legend rather than the legend, subscribing is what tells the algorithm to keep sending them your way. It takes a second and it decides what gets made next. Because this story isn't quite finished. 126 years after that first rifle sold for 30 pounds, the .600 Nitro Express is still in production. Barely. Small runs for a few dozen rifles and a handful of Austrian revolvers. It has outlived the profession it was designed for, the empire that profession served, and now the man who gave it its strangest second life. And the record it anchors is still sitting there, unclaimed and uncontested, waiting for somebody to decide the exchange rate is worth paying twice.